Okay. Test, test, test. All right. Let's hope fifth time is a charm. Oh, I'm having all kinds of TE problems. Okay. So sorry for those of you who might have been there earlier when my mic wasn't working, but hopefully this is working. Bear with me one second. I'm just going to double check the sound here. Let me take up the level. Hopefully this is better. Okay. All right. All right. It's been a while. Hey, everybody. I've been going through some of the comments from some of my older videos, and there was one that I've been meaning to talk about. And I was going to try to, I don't know. I was like, wanted to come up with some answer and find some videos or other things to point to, but I just kept going down the wrong rabbit hole. So I'm just going to do a little rambling on NI and address this comment that somebody left, I think, on one of my polar typing videos. I had it up, and of course, now I've closed out that tab. But the commenter was sort of asking on the polar test, why am I asking for introverted intuition, the polar test on introverted intuition? And for those of you who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, go try to find my polar test video, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. But I'm asking, questions trying to get at whether or not, you might be polar and introverted intuition, and asking things like, can you define justice from different perspectives, right? So the word justice, just in and of itself, come up with a definition, and then come up with a definition that a Catholic priest would use, and come up with a definition that a cowboy in the Old West might use, or maybe somebody from China or some other culture. And the idea is, can you come up with a definition of the word justice from different perspectives, right? Where different people might define justice in different ways. And what's going on here is what I'm looking at. Well, let me take a step back and sort of set the table for where I'm coming from on introverted intuition. And some of it overlaps with sort of the classic Jungian perspective on what intuition is. But then other parts might not completely overlap. And so I could see why there might be a disconnect, especially if, you're well trained and know a lot about the way that Carl Jung described it and thought about it, and others. And apparently in the socionics world, this commenter mentioned that they sort of think of it as like the ability to bind things across time, like think of things in past, present, and future. And I guess sort of thinking about like internally, mentally time shifting, going back in time, thinking about things in the present, thinking about things in the future. I'm not entirely sure that the way I think about introverted intuition maps onto that. Maybe I could talk about that in a minute after I talk about what I think it is. But I'll be the first to admit, I really haven't read into that. I don't really know what the argument or the definition is there. And so to the extent I'm sort of misinterpreting it, I apologize, and feel free to correct me. Okay, so let me step back and just sort of set the stage to how I think about introverted intuition. So, you have to think about the world or existence has two planes or two realms or two sort of fields of reality. There's the physical space, the physical field, the physical realm, and that's all the objects and time, space, and cause and effect, and things that you can measure and things that you can pick up and put in a box and move around and all that stuff. That's your physical world, right? And that's largely what we would associate with the sensing processes like SE, SI, and then really to a large extent all the other processes, but we'll set that aside for a second. Um, so that's the physical world. But then there's also this other world that is loosely defined as metaphysical or not physical. Metaphysical is kind of a bad word for it in this context because it used to mean different things back in the ancient days. But people will talk about it as the whatever the non-physical realm is, right? Um, and so you could think of it as the idealism world, like Platonic idealism. So it's about concepts, it's about meanings, it's about abstract ideas, things that you can't measure, feel, touch, put in a box, move around, and there's no real cause and effect. Jung described it as sort of an acausal world. And when he talked about things like the collective unconscious and symbolism and archetypes and um, synchronicity, he's talking about processing or sort of living in, interacting with, processing, however you want to think about it, in the metaphysical world as opposed to the physical world, right? So when you have dreams, you're sort of tapping into this metaphysical world, but then you're kind of representing it in a loose analogy or simulation of the physical world, but really it's built off of this non-physical stuff, right? And it's very hard to articulate because our brain and the way that we describe things is so tied to the physical world for probably obvious reasons that we talk about things in cause and effect kind of language. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And we talk about things in sort of experiential descriptions. But we've got a lot going on inside that we can't articulate or get out unless we sort of transform it into language that other people can process and understand, right? And so we could do that in one of two ways. We can, sort of describe things in physical attributes, like come up with, stories or descriptions of things, or we could just sort of talk about ideas in the abstract. But usually we have to sort of somehow tie it to metaphors and similes and a lot of like, what I mean, kind of um, descriptions because it's so hard to articulate what's going on in the metaphysical world, what our brain is processing, because we have to generate it in a way that other people understand what we're saying. Um, okay, and that's always a big issue in psychology because we're trying to figure out what's going on in somebody's head and a lot of times in the metaphysical world, but we're asking them to provide some sort of behavior, some sort of response that translates into the physical world. And so we never really know what's going on inside their head, whether, if they're conscious or unconscious of it, that kind of thing. But put that aside for now. Okay. So the metaphysical world is all about abstract meanings, concepts, things that are acausal and they're just associations between different concepts, different ideas. Okay. And both intuition functions, the extroverted and the introverted, are dealing in that plane, right? That's the plane that they're computing, processing, interacting with. And so when you have things like, dreams, you're presumably tapping into some sort of meaning, but then extracting it and representing it in some sort of physical way, some sort of sensation way, because that's just the way our brain processes things. Okay. So, and things like synchronicity. So, synchronicity is tapping into what Jung would call causal meanings, right? So, you're thinking about somebody that you haven't seen in 5 years or haven't seen them since high school. And then lo and behold, 15 minutes later, you're at the store and you run into this person, right? Now, your thinking about them didn't cause them to be at the store at the same time you're at the store, but you just get this sensation of synchronicity because you have this sort of overlap in the meaning world, in the metaphysical world, that sort of overlapped in time and space, right? And it sort of just creates this like, unique experience, because what was happening in your metaphysical world now all of a sudden manifested itself in the physical world, but I don't want to say it caused it in the physical world, right? Um, it just happened to overlap coincidentally. And it gives us that feeling of synchronicity, that there's some sort of deeper meaning going on in the world. Okay. Now, some people could just say, hey, that's just pure coincidence. Other people could say, hey, there's sort of a deeper meaning going on here. Symbols are the same thing. Archetypes are the same thing. You've got some sort of meaning embedded in your mind, in your unconscious or conscious, and you're tapping into that and sort of working with that material in your mind. Okay. So then, when you're in the metaphysical world and you're dealing with concepts and ideas, then the core essence is, what is the meaning of something? And then the meaning, let me give you a good example. So the iPhone has a particular meaning, right? You could just think of the iPhone as what it is, the phone, and what it does for you, all the different things you can do on it. But then it's also associated with other things, like it's kind of the hip thing to have. It's kind of the in-group popular thing to have, as opposed to, maybe an Android, where that might be more associated with somebody who's more techie, right? Or, isn't concerned about being in the in-group, or doesn't want to spend the money on an iPhone or whatever, right? But there's the thing, the phone, the iPhone, and what it does, and all the stuff inside the phone that makes it the phone and its function. But then all these other meanings that get tied to it. And then if somebody's in an in-group and has an iPhone, then you can make other associations with that person, and so on and so forth, right? But it all starts from your concept of the iPhone. And so introverted intuition, just intuition in general, let's just say, is making those associations between things and trying to figure out sort of, what the essence of something is, either an object or a concept, right? So when you're asked to define something like justice, a word like justice, or some abstract concept where it's not something you can measure, you can't measure justice, you can't put it in a put it on a scale and figure out how heavy justice is. You can't take out a ruler and figure out, you know, how what the width is, or anything like that. Now, you might be able to figure out, sort of societal effects and measure that kind of stuff, but you're not really measuring justice, right? You can't put justice in a box and mail it to your mom, right? So, what is it? It's an abstract idea. It lives in the metaphysical world. But when you're doing the polar tests, the first step is, okay, can you just give me a definition of justice? Just, what's the essence of justice? What's the meaning behind it? And so can you tap into that introverted intuition, which is trying to, well, it's not trying to, but it is your knowledge base in the metaphysical world, right? In the thoughts, ideas, abstract concepts world. Okay. And, but on the polar test, the whole point is to keep pressing you on it to see if you can use that information or bring it up into your consciousness with, um, and spend the energy and the resources to use it, what I would call flexibly, right? And so when you're using information flexibly, that means you can sort of bring it up and sort of move the bits and pieces around in your mind, metaphorically speaking, of course, right? There's a good example of how you have to sort of translate metaphysical concepts into physical concepts, right? Thinking about moving ideas and bits and pieces around. You're not really doing that, but the best way for me to describe it to you is to put it into physical terms, right? Okay. So if you're able to do that, then that means you can come up with different definitions flexibly. And you can think of how other people might think of justice, right? And sort of put yourself in their shoes. How does a cowboy, what would the essence of justice be to a cowboy? What would the essence of justice be to a Catholic priest? And it really is like trying to figure out what they think the essence of it is. So some people might argue, okay, isn't that more NE? You're kind of thinking of different possibilities and different outcomes out there in the world. And I could see that argument, but remember, we're trying to think of what they think the essence is, right? And not, you know, not trying to come up with a definition that is possible in in different worlds. Like, if we discovered some alien race on another planet, what would their definition of justice be? Well, we don't know, right? I mean, we could think of a lot of different possibilities, but it all sort of depends on who they are and, what they find important as far as keeping things orderly in their society. But when you're thinking of a Catholic priest or a cowboy, as long as you've got those concepts, then you can make associations in your head if you have flexible introverted intuition and come up with an answer that you think that they really would, you know, um, define justice as. Okay. Like that there really is a core essence for those people because you know something about them and you can form associations and then come up with a definition based off of those associations. Um, okay, I'm maybe splitting hairs there, but to me, it's more of an introverted intuition thing because it is about taking information, funneling it down into a core concept, into a knowledge concept. Okay. So, um, so to me, that's why it's a good question to press people on their introverted intuition. And based off of some of the feedback I've seen, people that I haven't seen anybody who's just straight up and bipolar respond to it. If you are out there, please do. Um, but but there have been a couple of people where NI is sort of on the bottom part of their stack, and they didn't like it apparently, right? So I think there's something there. But feel free to test it out. Okay, so now let's go back to whether or not this is about NI is about this sort of time-based concept. And I'm kind of struggling with it. And again, I've never seen this definition before, and so I could be completely off base of and misinterpreting it, and I don't want to do that. But I do think of time stuff as more physical world stuff, right? So when you have philosophers and whatnot who talk about idealism versus materialism, materialism is the physical world, all the objects, all the things that have cause and effect, all the things that you can measure. They talk about it as being the space-time world. That's your space-time world. And so when I think of time, I usually think more of the physical world as opposed to the metaphysical world. Now, I guess I could see, metaphysical stuff sort of withstanding time changes, right? Like your definition, if you have a core definition of justice, it's probably not going to change day by day, and it sort of withstands changes in the environment. But it could change based off of which culture you're in, right? So it's not completely fixed. Unless, well, I guess some people could make an argument that there is a real definition of justice, and then a bunch of other people have other definitions of justice, but that there's a real one out there somewhere. And I get that. And if that's the case, then yeah, that's going to stay steady throughout time. But I don't really see it as sort of time travel in the sense of like being able to think about what's going to happen in the future or what's going to happen in the past. If anything, that seems more NE. But also, any like NI is more tied to ideas, abstract concepts, to where thinking about how things are going to unfold in time might be more of a kind of SE thing. But it all depends on what you're talking about, right? Like, if I throw this cup into the wall, what's going to happen? To me, that just seems more SE, right? Like I'm thinking about what's going to happen in the physical cause and effect world. Now, if I'm thinking, somebody's going to get really upset about it, or things like that, that might be a little bit more intuition based, because now I'm sort of associating meanings and not necessarily just straight up physical processes. But it gets blurry. It definitely gets blurry. All this stuff overlaps, right? There's no, like I like to say that, there's not a whole lot of boundaries for any of these functions. They all work with each other. Anywho, okay. So I hope that answers the fundamental question. But let me know if you're out there and you see this, if, that helps at all. I think I'm going to leave it there. There's another concept I want to talk about, but I think I'm going to save that for another video, because it'll just send me down another rabbit hole, in another completely different avenue. So hope that helps. I realize I probably raised more questions than answers, but talking about metaphysics and the non-physical world is always, like I said, incredibly difficult, because it's almost impossible to describe or articulate what you're talking about without talking about it in sort of physical based language or metaphors. And so sometimes you'll say things that come across as being, well, isn't that like physical? Isn't that cause and effect? When it's really not what you mean, right? That there really is this like core concept underlying it. And I'm just, you're just trying to get the other person to tap into their own introverted intuition to understand where you're coming from. And quite frankly, when somebody's unipolar, your, what would those be? Your ESTJs and ESFJs. That's why it can be really hard to articulate sort of new ideas that don't have some sort of like physical backing, right? Like you can't point to other people who have done it. It's a brand new idea that you just came up with, and you're trying to convince them of, trust me, it's going to work. And they're like, well, okay, who else is doing it? Well, nobody, because it's my idea. Okay, well, let's just see what everybody else is doing. I laugh because I have a lot of conversations with ESTJs and ESFJs about that kind of stuff. And there is sort of this blind spot when you're trying to articulate some abstract concept, and it's not necessarily that they don't get it. They can get it, they just don't trust it as much as like an INFJ or an INTJ is going to, or an ENFJ or ENTJ for that matter. All right, looks like we got a comment here. Let's go here. Manly Hall's secret typing of all ages articulates intuitions and metaphysics patterns. Okay, cool. Thanks. I haven't seen that. So is that a book or is that a video? Somebody just pointed out somebody who talks about intuition and metaphysics. Let's see if they respond. But yeah, book from the early 1900s. Cool. Okay. So very cool. I'll have to check it out. Okay. Well, an occult philosopher, author, mystic. Okay. Those are always fun. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the metaphysical world, of course, gets tied to occult stuff, symbolism, archetypes, all that is, comes from this metaphysical world. And, that's the fun stuff, right? Associating all these ideas together. But, I mean, and the occult stuff, I mean, I know very, very little about it. So I can't speak to it intelligently, but it comes across as like trying to transcend from one realm into the other, right? So trying to take things from the meaning world and manifest them or have them somehow form in the physical world. Yeah. Hey. All right, we got a crew here. So I'll stick around if you guys have any questions or anything. Not that I know anything, but I'm happy to ramble. Yeah. So part of I'm just going to keep going here for a sec, but part of the rabbit hole that I kept falling into is this idea of idealism versus materialism. And yeah, there's a lot of people out there now who see reality as fundamentally consciousness or experience, and that everything is consciousness and the physical world is sort of a manifestation of that, sort of vibrations, that kind of thing. As opposed to the other way around, where, a lot of people think of it as you've got the physical world and somehow consciousness comes out of that. If I had to put myself in one camp or the other, I'm probably more in the materialistic camp. And that's why I sort of break things down into, brain areas, things like that. But I could certainly see the idealism argument. And maybe something's there. I just, again, it's very hard to articulate without explaining it in physical terminology, and so then it just sort of gets lost on me. Okay. Ideas always come first. Old philosophers understood the idea had to come before the material. Yeah. 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 It's very true. Um, or at least it's very true that that's what they argued. I can't say one way or the other, but you have to imagine an invention before you can create it. Mm, sometimes. I mean, there is the popular story of, what is it, Vaseline was like a byproduct of like distilling oil or something, and they just had all this like goop, and they're like, hey, we can use this for whatever, lotion or whatever people use Vaseline for. So sometimes things just happen, right? And if you're intuitive enough, you might think of a different use for it, right? Without somebody sort of pre-planning it. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of inventions you have to think about it first and work through the problem. But there are plenty of sort of serendipitous things where things sort of get invented on their own or things happen and then people find a use for them, right? um, so yeah. Okay, let's see here. Agreed, it's all connect the dots, find the link between fundamental laws of nature and consciousness of human beings. Yeah, that's the big question. That's I wish I had an answer, man, because I'd be writing my paper and get my Nobel Prize. But it's obviously a difference of perspective, and I, would certainly encourage everybody to check out the idealists out there. They make some good arguments, but I think of things as like, what is your brain doing? What are the different parts of your brain doing? And I don't know if that's materialistic or something else, but um, because there's just too much coincidence, right? Like the same people or different people who get the same lesion to the same parts of the brain, or even animals, it always results in the same sort of cognitive dysfunction, right? And so if there wasn't something going on there that's materialistic, then I don't understand, why does the same lesion in 20 different people lead to the same cognitive deficit and also preserve other cognitive or conscious abilities, right? I mean, why is it not just random? Um, and so there's got to be some sort of interaction between the two. It's just people disagree on what comes first, I guess. But anywho, that's probably going way overboard. But I think the bottom line is introverted intuition is, your knowledge function. How do you build up knowledge on abstract concepts that you have not experienced in the physical world, right? Nobody's told you this. You just sort of come up with it and read between the lines. Yeah, right. Just like your eyes don't pick up scent. Exactly. But there might, I don't know, there might be other animals where maybe their eyes do smell things. That would be cool. But kind of like a dispel of the illusion of natural laws being different to the essence of a conscious being. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idealists sort of see, there's sort of this ribbon of consciousness out there, and it just sort of, it's like waves on a pond, and the waves sort of create whatever the physical things are. Um, and that's fine. I get it. And I'm sure there's something there. But what I just don't understand is why, you know, does every brain operate the same way, right? Why don't we just have a bunch of different random brains that, that might all do the same thing, but they do it in different ways? But I don't know. Right. Well, you have enough to worry about in New York City, just with your nose, let alone your eyes. But, all right, cool. I think I'm going to call it. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by. Thanks for those of you who are watching the video in the future. And I will hopefully be back with more soon. All right, cool. Talk to you guys later.